It's one of the things that when I was doing Project KISS, and then when I was seeing some of the, I guess you would call more of the administrative types of strategic approaches to organized crime, I became very disillusioned. And I know your listeners are going to know this. One of the inside challenges of policing is egos, politics, turf wars, that type of thing.
Bend, don't break. This is a Delta Police podcast.
Hear more about how police officers strengthen their resiliency through the power of story.
Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to episode 67 of Bend, Don't Break. And I have the pleasure today of being able to speak with someone who I knew in a past life when I worked with the Edmonton Police Service and was in our tactical team way back then. And this is going to be a really unique kind of Bend, Don't Break. So I really encourage you to be able to listen up because there's some great life lessons in today's session. This person I'm speaking to, Bob Stenhouse, began his career undercover in Vancouver, actually. And you know that in Bend Don't Break, we've spoken to several undercover operators before who have experienced all kinds of challenges, both mentally and family-wise in relation to their work undercover. And Bob is going to talk a little bit about that, but it's really unique because he went from an undercover world and then went on to an organization within the RCMP called CERT, which it was the impetus for what we know as the counterintelligence team now, or counter-terrorism team now, that we currently have as JTF2. So CERT was this amazing team of tactical officers that served Canada in sort of anti-terrorism kind of projects and missions. Then from that, he went back to Edmonton in K Division and worked on a project called KISS, which dealt with the Hells Angels. And I'm going to let that story unfold by itself, but it made its way in 2001 to Maclean's and to Fifth Estate as well. So you can see that it had high profile during the time that Bob was at the UC in that particular operation. And then there was some whistleblowing. And as a result of that, it changed life and dramatically changed the career trajectory of Bob. So Bob, first of all, welcome to Bend, Don't Break. Thrilled to be able to have you here. Good to see you, old friend.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. I've been following you on LinkedIn for years, and I'm just so admire progressive, thoughtful chiefs of police, and so you're up there in my books as far as how you're leading your particular department, and I admire everything going on with Delta Police.
Well, thank you for the compliments, and we have a great team here, so I'm really blessed. Bob, I want to talk about, first of all, sort of currently, and a little bit about your history, just how long in the RCMP, and then sort of what happened from there.
Yeah, so at my core, even though I've done like the undercover and the search stuff, but at my core, I'm an investigator. I mean, I've always have been. I love investigations, and it was an area that I was able to shine in my policing career. I did most of my service in plainclothes units. And so I spent 20 years in the RCMP. It didn't end well, as you stated. There's a whole bunch of story behind that I will share. I don't mind sharing. But since that time, I've been involved in more on the corporate investigation side. I was a human rights investigator with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. I was a private investigator for a couple of years. I spent 10 years with Alberta Health Services in charge of corporate investigations for the whole organization, 110,000 employees, leading investigative strategies and oversight of high complex, high risk investigations. And then I launched my own company in 2018, Veritas Solutions, and it was just me at the time. We're up to about 30 investigators right across Canada. We do workplace investigations, regulatory investigations, sport investigations, and we have a whole branch on church and faith-based investigations as well. Yeah, we're doing about 250 investigations a year. We have a senior leadership team, and then we also have a big part of our business is our proactive training, where we have a director of our corporate training as well. So it's really been this massive growth since 2018 in the areas that I've spent the good, the bad, the ugly in terms of investigations for 40 years.
Your success is certainly very well known around the policing world, and investigations certainly go into areas that are difficult, that regulatory area that are difficult to be able to come to some conclusions on. And I know that you've got a quality team of highly competent investigators. So congratulations on your success there.
Yeah,
And,
thanks.
and I want to take you back, way, way, way back to your first opportunity to be a UC operator and a little bit of work you did out in Vancouver here.
Yeah, well, actually, no, interesting. It actually started in Cranbrook, BC, and
Okay.
so my first that was back in the days, Neil, when Miami Vice was big, and I wanted to be Miami Vice, but I was in Cranbrook, British Columbia, and so I did get onto the drug enforcement unit, a two-person drug enforcement unit. Got to grow my hair long back in the day, and drive an old beater pickup truck, and we basically run around the Kootenays at back in those days, buying drugs, right? Local drug traffickers, small town drug traffickers. I then switched out to Vancouver, and I spent a little bit of time in Surrey, and then I ended up working in the Vancouver Drug Enforcement Unit. And then actually again going backwards, I actually spent a year and a half in Delta, embedded in a joint forces operation in drug enforcement with Delta PD. That would have been back about 88 or so, 87, 88. And then I started working on the undercover units in Vancouver in the late 80s as well. So, kind of beginning from small town drug enforcement, drug traffickers, drug dealers, all the way up to the international stuff within Vancouver and kind of everything in between.
Yeah, amazing. And then you had the opportunity to go to Ottawa and be in CERT for a while. Tell me a little bit about that journey as well.
I always joke, and again, back in the day, I had hair down to here, so I said I got a haircut and got sort of a real job. So CERT evolved out of what was called HRT, or the Hostage Rescue Team that the RCMP had developed back in the early 80s. At the time, Canada did not have a coordinated terrorist response team. So CERT evolved out of that, and I had the pleasure of trying out. And of course, you can imagine the level of fitness you had to have back then. So I went from the smoky bars undercover to getting myself in shape enough to make the CERT team, which was a challenge in itself. And we spent 2 years. I spent 2 years in Ottawa on the CERT team, and it was at that time that the government, I think rightly so, chose to transition or transfer that responsibility to the military. So that's what you talked about, JTF2. So this was all cutting edge stuff. The team was trained by the British SAS. We would do some cross training with the Navy SEALs. They came up to Dwyer Hill outside of Ottawa, where our compound was. And we kind of prided ourselves that we could hold our own with the Navy SEALs, both in everything we do, whether it be rappelling or shooting or whatever it was we did. So it was a really, really interesting and good experience.
And what would possess you to be able to come back to Edmonton in K Division and then be able to go on to the undercover team there again?
Yeah, well, actually, I went back to Vancouver again, where coming out of CERT with short, kind of hair that you would expect of the guys on the anti-terrorist team, and I went right back to undercover work in Vancouver. And so, believe it or not, I actually had hair extensions put into my hair so that I could kind of fit in with what we were trying to portray ourselves. And that's where I was involved. I'm one of the pioneers on the Mr. Big investigation techniques, Neil, for a few years in the 90s. And that's when I transferred into Edmonton on the biker intelligence unit back in 96 is when I went back there from undercover again from Vancouver, Mr. Big Stuff, into Edmonton.
Now, I've got a picture of you that I'll share certainly when we post this podcast as well. Long hair, and at that
Yeah,
point in time, it looked black or certainly dark brown for sure.
it was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know
I,
that there was. I'm
I
sorry, go
always
ahead, Bob.
I always say that I earned my white hair, Neil.
Yes, and it's true, and we're going to talk about that because there's some great life lessons, and I think that when I spoke to you previously, you have some wisdom there that I want to be able to make sure we
Yeah.
share with the people that listen.
Yeah.
So you went on to Project KISS. Now, I remember that project because we did a heck of a bunch of work on the clubhouses and the motorcycle gangs in Edmonton, and there was some work in Red Deer as well. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so Project Kiss was a biker. It started off. I mean, I was in the biker intelligence unit, but I was always more focused on gathering evidence and prosecuting. Basically, I always said that if we're going to say that the Hell's Angels and the biker gangs are engaged in organized crime, we should be proving it. And so I was more about proving it versus talking about it. And we had a great team. We had two folks from the Edmonton Police Service. That was our core team. Myself and still a dear friend, Bill Appleby, and I were the RCMP LAPD core team, and we basically began with it was an agent undercover. We would bring in other undercover operators, and I was kind of the quarterback of the whole investigation. It was a year-long investigation. We ended up getting convictions of 7 patch-wearing members of the motorcycle gang at the time, culminating in, as you recall, some big busts that went on all around the Edmonton area. So it was a very, very successful investigation, very high risk and complexity. We're running wiretap investigations. It was money laundering, drug trafficking. We did the very first reverse sting in Canada. And what a reverse sting is for your listeners is where we sold drugs to the bikers. And we had to, of course, go through a whole bunch of kind of checks and balances on that. But it was the very first one in Canada. New legislation came out that we could actually sell drugs to people that were looking to buy drugs. And so that was part of Project KISS as well. Neil, I won't show the photograph, but I have a photograph that we took after the day of the roundup, what we call the roundup. And you were in the photograph, as were many of your old colleagues from Edmonton Police Service as well. And we're letting off a little bit of steam and just, kind of celebrating a really, really difficult, challenging, but successful investigation.
Absolutely. I remember it well. And in saying that, you know what, I know that you showed a tremendous amount of resilience, persistence, commitment, grit to be able to get to that point, to be able to go through this world of undercover to the hostage rescue team or search and then back to undercover. But there's something in 2001 that led us to the Maclean's article and the Fifth Estate article. And tell me sort of how we got there.
Yeah, Neil, it's one of the things that when I was doing Project KISS, and then when I was seeing some of the, I guess you would call more of the administrative types of strategic approaches to organized crime, I became very disillusioned. And I know your listeners are going to know this. One of the inside challenges of policing is egos, politics, turf wars, that type of thing. And so, in the middle of all the politics, turf wars, lack of trust, and egos, I was really, really frustrated, and I had a lot of pressure on me as leading Project KISS, but also trying to break down some of the silos that I was seeing happening, whether you have your drug enforcement, your proceeds of crime, your intelligence units, all of these silos that weren't working together. And I'm all about teamwork, as you are. And so, using the skills and the capacity of all team members for the common goal, the common good. In the middle of that, I became very disillusioned. And within that disillusionment and some personal, frankly, very poor leadership of one of the leaders that I was working with that was contributing to the politics silos and turf wars, I ended up being on a committee where we were looking at developing a government response to organized crime, particularly bikers at the time. They were the big priority at the time. It's changed now. And within that, I saw some things that were, if not outright false in terms of information that I was saying that at the very least, it showed that there was really not a proper response to how to deal with organized crime. And it had more to do with PR versus actually contributing to the people that were solving crime and making sure that they had the tools to solve crime. In that, I ended up giving some documents to an author. I was burned out. Again, we'll talk about PTSD and burnout in a little bit, but I was absolutely burned out. I was exhausted and I wasn't thinking straight. I gave some documents to an author that didn't shine a great light on the overall strategy of the senior chiefs of police across Canada. He used the documents in a book. I had no clue he was going to do that. I want to be very clear. There was no intelligence, like in terms of criminal intelligence, or no secrets that were disclosed in terms of investigative. This had to do with media strategy documents and other strategic direction that was, in my view, significantly, not just mine, everyone working operationally, we would say this is absolutely missing the mark. And so anyway, these documents were reprinted. I had been promoted to staff sergeant by that time, Neil. I was the youngest staff sergeant in Alberta. working very closely with our CEO at the time in the administrative function. And I was saying that I also got a haircut and a sort of real job as well. And when this happened, I ended up walking right into the commander. It took me about 15 minutes to figure out what to do. People were speculating that someone else had given these documents to the author. I walked into the commanding officer's office and I told him, I said, everyone's speculating about this. Look no further. I'm the person that did this. I take responsibility for it and I will cooperate to make sure that this resolved.
Now, I know the name of your company now has actually reflects a little bit in that as well. Tell us just about that.
Yeah, we evolve, we grow, we learn. I mean, it's not that I've been perfect in my past, but I also realize that, we have to be committed to the truth. And if we're not committed to the truth and we're not making decisions based on the truth, leaders, investigators, whoever are going to make poor decisions. And so my evolution of understanding and trying my very best well, I have it on the sign behind me here, speak truth and seek truth, trying my very best. And I thought when I'm starting my company, Veritas Solutions is actually our mission statement, and that means you will find solutions when you're focusing on the truth. And so that really has been, our kind of mission statement. That is what we do as well.
Now, I think by coming forward, number one, it takes integrity and it takes someone be willing to be able to accept responsibility. I don't think you expected the sort of reaction that came forward from that because it led to sort of you turning in your badge, I think on, if I have the date right, January 8th, 2000.
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened, of course, I wasn't, privy to all the, I guess for lack of a better word, the politics behind everything. And but I became privy to it because I ended up doing freedom of information requests and I got thousands and thousands of documents. But what really happened was there was some, frankly, some bruised police leader egos that got in the way, and demanding justice and outrage and all of that type of thing coming from one particular former police chief out of Eastern Canada. And I had the memo that he sent to the commissioner of the RCMP demanding I get fired. And so when you had that level of senior level police officers, dealing with other chiefs and demanding I get fired. So what happened was there was this series of events where, in my view, they began, and that's why I do what I do now. But they began from the perspective of we need, it's confirmation bias. We need to find ways to fire him versus understand what brought him to this place that would cause him to share these documents. And I think that focus, and I ended up going through a 2 week. It was in the news, and a 2 week internal process, disciplinary process. But within that, I think that they really missed the mark, and they did because I ended up appealing my termination from the RCMP to the Federal Court of Canada, and I ended up winning my appeal at the Federal Court of Canada, which of course made the story even that much more, I think, interesting, and why it garnered so much attention from the national media.
Absolutely. And, certainly if anyone is interested, there's still a McLean's article out, and the Fifth Estate program has done an episode on this as well. But I want to talk about the impact now in relation to yourself, your family, and what you were going through. And as a result of both your undercover work leading up to this, documents that were shared, right through to sort of even where you're at now.
Yeah. Neil, in the 1990s, as you know, we didn't talk about post-traumatic stress. We didn't even know what it was. We thought that was something you hear about with the military. We didn't even consider in policing there'd be such a thing. And if you were to have disclosed that you were struggling with your mental health, that would have been a career ender, in the policing community back in the day. And I know police have come a long way, and you're one of the champions of mental health and policing as well. I was absolutely burned out, absolutely hyper vigilant at all times, later diagnosed post traumatic stress disorder. And frankly, back in those days, our only method of dealing with it was self medication, usually alcohol, because of course drugs were illegal. And so I was your stereotypical overachiever, extremely hardworking, burning out, self-medicating with alcohol type of cop. But I always say the people that aren't really all that passionate about their job don't usually burn out. my burnout was from my drive and my passion to be the best police officer I could be. That's where my burnout came from, without having any checks and balances and mechanisms in terms of understanding that. So so it was a journey back in those days, and it was actually a blessing in disguise when I had to turn my badge in. It caused for some dark nights of the soul. Who am I? What's my identity? And I remember, whether I read it or I just thought about it, I have a choice to go forward. Do I get bitter or do I get better? And I chose better, and it was a series of discipline towards getting better, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, that I engaged on for a number of years. And it's still a journey. I mean, I still struggle sometimes with the aftermath of my PTSD and some of the other pain that came out of that.
I want to unpack that a little bit, and we will definitely go into some of the strategies that you used. But often I've heard out of the 67 podcasts that I've done, probably on at least half of them, if not more, the actual conscious choice that I'm going to take control of this myself and I'm going to get better,
Yeah.
right? Rather than going into that spiral of doom that often we can get ourselves into, feeling sorry for ourselves, being victims instead of victors, and then really just going downhill for everything that we believe in, our families, our work, and every type of relationship we have. So tell me, when you started realizing this, what was happening around you? What were you seeing around you?
Well, it's interesting, Neil. In hindsight, and even at the time, I mean, I've lost friends and colleagues to suicide. I've lost friends and colleagues to homicide. I've lost friends and colleagues to drug addiction. And I was watching that, again, my identity was stripped away. I joined the police when I was 20 years old. I didn't have any other adult identity that I could fall back on. And so I really had to do that deep dive, reinventing myself, re-explore my historical spiritual faith, and really kind of focus on me as an individual versus me and my identity as a police officer. And letting that go and saying, yeah, okay, it was an experience. I have to learn from it. I need to grow from it. Did I do everything perfect? Absolutely not. But I'll tell you the other thing that I saw happening, Neil, and I'm sure that your listeners would agree. What hurt the most in policing and what still haunts me the most is, as like you, I've seen a lot of violence. I've been around a lot of violence. I've been shot at, stabbed at, too much blood to think about in terms of my policing career. But what really hurt the most was the internal backstabbing and the throwing people under the bus and the jockeying for positions and the silos and that come out in this really mean-spirited behavior towards police officers that they can have towards each others. I was identified by this chief of police who had never met me as engaging in the most corrupt act he had ever seen in his career. And to call someone of my dedication and commitment and integrity corrupt, it just cut at my core because I was not corrupt. Might have been ill-informed in how I was expressing my frustrations, but it was not corrupt. And so that's the type of stuff that I think most honest cops would say hurts the most is the internal stuff.
I think
Um,
you've picked up on the second piece. You're absolutely right. So the first comes around the conscious recognition to be able to move forward, leave the past behind you, and actually take responsibility. But much of the stress that I've heard officers or first responders feel is often internal stress rather than external stress.
yeah.
It comes from the management within the organizations. It comes from sort of workplace culture that isn't up to speed in relation to respectful workplaces. It's not creating that psychologically safe workplace where we need to be. And I know that your organization actually investigates a lot of that now. But tell me a little bit more about the sort of the stress that you were feeling as a result of the organization and the loss of identity.
Well, as an example, Neil, after, if you remember the Hell's Angel patchover in Red Deer in 1997, where my burnout was at its peak because I was conducting Project Kiss, which was what the wiretap, the undercover, the investigative, but we were also down in Red Deer, and there was a lot of stuff that went on that was very problematic that even hit the news and the courts and stuff like that. And after that, I came back and I actually submitted on a memo my resignation from the RCMP. And my boss at that time, that I don't believe was a strong leader and was a very weak leader, he reprimanded me for putting my resignation on the wrong form. In other words, I put it on a memo, but he said, well, you have to put it on form 1392 or whatever the numbers were in the RCMP. And I'm like, if I look back now at 15 years service, I was a high flyer back in the day, very young sergeant. If I look back now and a young up and coming sergeant puts in their resignation, I'm probably not going to reprimand them to put it on the right form. I'm going to try to understand there's something from a mental health perspective going on. I mean, we didn't have that type of lens put on mental health that we hopefully do now. But I think I mean, it's still a fear. There's still stigma attached to any police officer coming forward and saying, I'm struggling with my mental health. And that was a big part of that back in those days.
Absolutely. So, how did you begin to find yourself after you recognize that you take control and you go forward? Tell me about how you begin to find your new identity, sort of how that happened with your family and I know that you are a spiritual person and have strong faith as well, which is helpful. And we've heard that from numerous other people within our
Mhm.
podcast as well.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, from a policing perspective, I mean, you lose your identity. It is an existential crisis. And I believe many of us go through these existential crises in our lives. Depending on how that happens, it could be other types of trauma or those types of things. And so I really went through this existential crisis. Who am I? Why am I here? What's the big picture? Is there a big picture? And I grew up going to church as a kid. And I started to explore that. I ended up moving even within that and becoming a lifelong learner. Neil ended up getting my master's in theological studies, and so this was kind of that evolution of both my spiritual side, but healing my emotions, healing my emotional side, my traumas, and keeping my body fit was a big part of that, and still is. I mean, I'm slowed down a little bit in my 60s, but I'm still fairly fit for my age, and still is a big part of that.
Now, did you ever see formally a psychologist or anything as you went through?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember the day that I self-disclosed to the commanding officer at the time that I was the person that gave these documents. I booked a I booked a session, I think, for the next day with a psychologist who had done a lot of therapy with police officers. And I think I was a model client or patient, whatever they want to call us, because I was just an open book. Here's what's here's what's going on. I mean, this was only one part of my whole life that was unraveling. My marriage had unraveled. I was losing. My dad passed away within that time frame. There was all kinds of things going on, and I was just kind of an open book. I'm just saying, like, here's what's going on in my life. I don't know how to deal with it, and so I went probably a good year to 2 years of intensive psychotherapy, in addition to my own motivation. As being on tactical units, I mean, you're dealing with some really highly focused people that, if they're goal oriented, they'll meet that goal. And so my goal was to get well, and I was willing and able to be open to therapy, as well as just continuing to grow and learn and read and do things that were healthy for me. So I was very much goal oriented in getting well.
Did your alcohol consumption ever sort of turn into an addiction at all?
It would have. I have no doubt. Back in the late 90s, working undercover, you're in the bars all the time. So you're around alcohol, very unhealthy working environment. Back in the day, they smoked in the bars. So you're in secondhand smoke the whole time. You're around alcohol all the time. Had this kind of defining moment in my life not occurred, I have no doubt that I was on my way to becoming an alcoholic. I mean, now that I know what I know, looking hindsight, for sure that it would have had a big impact on on my ability to live. Yeah.
I'm interested in the time frame that this was all happening, if there were services available through the RCMP or even services now that are available. I know that there's many good programs now federally that will allow people to come back and be able to explore other kinds of treatments for PTSD.
I think no, there wasn't for sure. But the other thing that I'm concerned about, and I still see it because I'm connected, as you know, on LinkedIn with a lot of police officers, and I get people reaching out to me on occasion, say, "Hey, Bob, you posted something that really resonated with me," and I think one of the problems that I see, and whether it be policing or in first responder, is that if you look at behavior that could be attributed to the symptom of PTSD, so in other words, self-destructive behavior, police officers that are driving drunk or that are engaged in risky activity, that can highly likely be traced back to a symptom of PTSD. Whereas leaders oftentimes are just looking at the behavior itself and saying this is bad behavior and we need to discipline you and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as opposed to looking at it more holistically to say, is it possible that this behavior is attributed to PTSD? And if so, how can we both support the officer to get better and get well, and yet still hold them accountable for the behavior? And I think that's a tension for any police leader to say, we have bad behavior that we know we have to hold them to account. Is it attributable to PTSD? And what's our responsibility to be able to really walk that fine line with that right amount of balance in terms of both support and accountability?
You know, I have three questions left, and I'm going to say all three right now, and then we'll go through each one of them. What is your advice sort of to young people entering this particular profession? What would be your advice to police leaders that are caring for young people coming into the profession? And third, sort of what you're seeing in the work that you're doing in all these different organizations that would be good practice for police departments to learn from, because you're seeing a host of different organizations, all with sort of respectful workplaces and psychologically safe workplaces. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure there's some tips and tricks we can all take away.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. And I mean, some of our clients have been first responder and police agencies as well, right? Where we either go and investigate or do some training with. So, to your first point for younger officers, I mean, if I were to talk to Bob Stenhouse, back in my 20s, I would say, maintain balance, don't get cynical. Surround yourself by the good people that are out there, because we can tend to get a little bit cynical about people, because we see the darkest of the dark. So I mean that would be the one piece of advice. And just look after yourself, right? That we have to have some grace and understanding trauma. Oh boy, if I would have been trauma informed back in my early 20s and 30s, it would have absolutely changed the way that I policed in terms of understanding behavior. So become trauma informed, don't lose sight of the need to be compassionate and have empathy for people, even those that were committing crimes. And that's one of the things that I think that gift that I had working undercover is I was always able to have empathy for people. And then, just really, kind of keep balanced and focus with good people around you. Get therapy if you need it. If you're not processing, if things are really happening in your life and seem to be unraveling, and also don't let being a police officer be your whole identity. It was my identity. That's all I knew and I did it well. So of course, then the ego does get in play. And so that becomes your identity. It becomes who you are. And when you leave policing, it's no longer who you are. And so we have to really understand, what is our identity?
Absolutely. And what about managers? What would they do? What would leaders do within organizations to reduce that stress that seems to make work so difficult for people, and certainly improve their anxiety in relation to the workplace itself?
Yeah, you know what I think is critical in policing, Neil, that I say if I were to sum it up in one word in terms of police leadership, and I'd say wisdom. We need leaders, managers up the ranks. We need more wisdom and less ego. We need more wisdom and less, kind of hard-nosed approaches. We really need discernment and wisdom at the leadership level. And I was in my own mind, I guess if I was praying back in the day, I don't even know it was praying, but I often lamented, where are the wise leaders? Where are the good people that I could learn from and grow from and will help me navigate both my my maturity, right? Don't forget, I mean, I had a badge at 20, Neil. I don't know how old you were, but at 20 years old, giving a badge and a gun to a 20-year-old, in hindsight, you're like, wow, what were they thinking? But I was looking for wise leaders. I always have looked for wise leaders, and sadly, I would see behaviors coming out of leadership that was quite unwise. And so I really think that police leaders need to show that level of emotional intelligence, maturity, psychological safety, and get out of their own ego so that they can help others. And I think that's a big thing that I see right across first responders. But obviously coming from a policing background.
Yeah, no, great comments. I agree.
Yeah.
And finally, sort of in the work that you're doing, is there anything that sticks out to you as best practice or excellent practice or leading practice, whatever we want to call it, but anything that sticks out to you that we can be more aware of as police departments and how we can take care of our people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Neil, I mean, I know that you're up on the issues surrounding, sexual harassment cases, primarily from male colleagues towards female colleagues, which is another area of pain. Frankly, my son's mom was a police officer, so I saw it, from both sides occur in terms of, the sexual harassment aspects of things, and so we're still seeing it. It's in the news. I mean, I could pretty well look at, Google something every week, and there's some new lawsuit against police departments for historical sexual harassment. So it's still a live issue. And frankly, I always say that the frontline supervisor, so your corporals, your sergeants, they're the ones that are going to set the tone for their watch. They're the ones that are going to set the tone for their expectation related to civility, respectful conversations amongst each other, and making sure that these risk factors coming out of disrespect don't escalate to that point. And so I really emphasize that if police services, want to mitigate those risks of the harassment cases, sexual harassment cases, it begins at that frontline supervisor level of both how they model what it's like to be a leader, but as well as what they will not tolerate in terms of if they see things that are going sideways. I'd like to share a story with you just to illustrate, Neil. Recently, I was contacted by an assistant commissioner from the RCMP from Eastern Canada on LinkedIn because she sees some of the stuff that I do on LinkedIn. And she said, Bob, you might not remember me, but there was a time in my career, Neil, where I left Undercover. Before I came to Edmonton, I spent 6 months in Richmond Detachment. So I was a watch supervisor, NCO at Richmond Detachment. And she said, you won't remember me, but I remember you. And you did something that I will never forget. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I'd like to chat with you. And so she told me, she said, Bob, I was a young constable. And one of the officers used a particularly graphic, derogatory cuss word that begins with C in our watch briefing. And she said, right away, I watched you and you shut it down. And you actually said to this person that, look, we don't use language like that. It's offensive to some. It might not be offensive to you, but it's offensive to some. So I'd like you to clean it up. And something along those lines and that impacted this young, impressionable, 1 year service female officer who is now an assistant commissioner in the RCMP. And so it's those little moments of, I think, correction, guidance, wisdom, etc., that leaders can help mitigate those types of things from occurring.
Great example. Absolutely. It's often the little things that contribute to the larger workplace, the respect we have in the workplace. So you're right on.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to be able to say thank you. Thank you for being so frank and full. And I want to give the mic back to you in a few seconds and talk about sort of where people can read more about you and your company as well.
Yeah.
But you said some things that I think are hugely valuable that I just need to summarize. First of all, we are responsible for our own mental health and our wellness. Take responsibility for it. Have a wellness plan. Make sure you're prepared for anything that's going to happen. Be trauma informed and be prepared. So that's
Yeah.
the first thing I heard you say loud and clear.
Yeah.
Second thing is that it's critical for us to be able to ensure that we are working in an environment where we create it being safe for others. So if you're a supervisor of any sort, an NCO of some sort, make sure that you're creating a respectful workplace for others so that they then can benefit from your leadership going forward.
Yeah.
Third is that you have demonstrated, not just sort of talked about, but demonstrated a high degree of hope we all have hope in what we're doing, and you went through a tremendously tumultuous time that was very public, and from that, you came out, and not only were you persistent, you showed grit to get through there, you showed your commitment to overall achievement, and you have thrived through it. So you weren't a victim.
Yeah.
You didn't have victimitis. You definitely contributed to your own well-being through your physical health and by taking control. So congratulations. I'm just so happy for you and your family, and for you to be able to be doing so well in your own business now.
Yeah,
But
thanks.
tell me, where can people either reach out to you or learn more about your business?
Yeah, thanks. Veritas Solutions is our website. We have a lot of, by the way, we have a lot of former police officers working in our investigations team. LinkedIn. As you know, Neil, I'm very active on LinkedIn, talking about these types of things and leadership and challenges and stressors and risks. We are a risk and trauma informed company, and so I'm always looking, to kind of anticipate the risks, and of course, at my core, notwithstanding that we support a lot of industries right across, primarily Western Canada, but right across Canada, in our services. But my heart is still with police officers. It's a noble profession. It's a good profession. The badge has been tarnished in some ways, and sometimes rightly so. And I know that with progressive leaders like yourself and others that I'm watching, that I think that there is this evolution towards the expectations that the public has of the police in terms of accountability, but never losing the sight of the fact that this is a very distinct and noble profession, and we need protectors, and we need people that are willing to put their life in danger to keep a just and safe society. Whatever, if my story can help someone have some hope, and maybe just one person out there have some hope that this too shall pass. I've been through many, many dark places in my life, and it will pass if we, like you said, we do take control. By the way, I did want to be the victim for a short period of time,
Yes.
and play the poor me thing, but that's not who I am. So I just kind of got back up, and it's still a journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great lessons. I'm absolutely grateful. I would encourage people to connect with you on LinkedIn. I think your messages are wise from a wise leader. So just as we spoke about, and I'm grateful that you took the time to be able to share your story on our podcast and share it with many young police officers who are entering the profession and want to do good in this world.
Well,
So
I
thank you.
appreciate it, Neil, and thanks so much for having me on.
Great.